And we are live with Catrin Wigfall. She is a policy fellow with the Center of the American Experiment. Just making sure that I get the name right because I am terrible with names. Anybody who watches us every day can understand that. Catrin, I'm sorry. See, there I go. Right. Starting from the beginning. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me. Pleased to be here.
I wanted to talk to you because I saw a report come out from you guys. I read it. It was the first thing I had seen about accountability in Minnesota public schools in a long time. It seems to be a conversation that ended at some point. I can remember in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and even going in the 2010s, it was a topic of conversation, and eventually it kind of just died in some ways. So I was really interested in talking to you. There's some things in your report that I think need to be said again, just to put on the record again, that are really important. So I thought I'd bring you on since you hold all the information. You hold the keys to all the information. No pressure whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. All the information in the report, and still learning more that can be added onto it for future conversations, for sure.
Well, there's some points in it that I think are explosive in some ways, but some are just like basic. Let's just start from the beginning. Minnesota prides itself on its equitable funding formula for schools, how much it spends. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I've said this on the record many times. It may have changed, but at one point, Minnesota was spending 40% of its budget on health and human services and 40% on education. And for people who went to public school, that's 80% in total. So,
Right.
So they were living on the other 20%.
And right now, it's 41.3% of the budget is education, which is more than public safety, transportation, and health and human services combined.
And what you were saying about that in your report is that there's not results to show for it. And let's, you knocked out a couple of myths. So I just want to make sure that we get them on the record at the beginning. You said spending has been increasing, not decreasing.
Correct.
Is that right?
Even when adjusted for inflation, yes.
Even when adjusted for inflation. So spending has been going up. You also say that achievement has not been rising along with it.
Unfortunately, right, we would hope to see that the more money that we spend, our students are performing better, we're getting more bang for our education buck, and unfortunately that's not the case. Either we've been stagnant in subjects that matter most, or unfortunately in decline in some of those subjects too. So it really paints a picture of Minnesota being allergic to accountability if we can't discuss, okay, here's how much we're spending, here are the results, where's the disconnect? Because clearly, more money is not fixing these disparities and a persistent achievement gap that we've been struggling with for years.
And that's not just for kids of color. That's just in general that it's flat. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. White student performance has been stagnant or in decline. Even when you look at an achievement gap, which is typically it's discussed between white students and students of color, but it's even persistent between students from wealthier backgrounds and then their low income peers. So it's not just limited to racial categories, but yeah, Minnesota students overall, there's just something going on, and money is not being able to solve these problems.
But it doesn't seem like people in the public here know that.
They don't.
They rate the schools very highly, right?
They do. And Minnesotans take pride in their public schools, and we take pride in a lot of things that our state offers. But when you really dig into a lot of the state rankings that Minnesotans point to, as they say, oh, check out how good our education system is, when you dig into those rankings, you find that those rankings are deceiving, and it really doesn't provide an apples to apples comparison that shows just how good or not so good Minnesota's public education system is. So we can, be happy to dive into that, because a lot of rankings like those from Education Week and U.S. News and World Report, they place Minnesota's public school system in the top 10, top 12, but that is because they don't account for student diversity, different student populations that states serve. So different socioeconomic statuses get kind of lost in the mix, if you will. And they include things that really don't always measure student performance or actual learning, such as graduation rates. And then they factor in per pupil spending, which also kind of undermines states who spend far less and use and do more with fewer resources, but still get the same achievement results as states who spend more per student.
So one of the things I don't understand, and maybe you can help me with, is it does seem that the schools are rated highly on things like the U.S. What is it? U.S. News and World Report rankings, and it's like the sixth or the seventh. Minnesota ranks very highly there. But then when you get to breaking it down by race, it falls like well below some other states that don't have our demographics. Is that just it doesn't rank so here's one of the things I don't understand. When I looked at one of the charts that you had, it basically said that even white student achievement is flat, and it isn't amazing. So how does a school system rise so high in the rankings or in our public mind, our own public perception, when in reality, even for white kids, it's a little bit mediocre?
That's a great question and something that isn't explored or talked about enough. And so I try to dive into that more in the report. And what I have found is that rankings like US News and World Report, they don't account for student diversity. So they will report a state average versus factoring in student performance by group or by different ethnic category. And because of that, a state like Minnesota, who is predominantly made up of white students, think it's like nearly 65%, they could do better on paper because of that socioeconomic status than any great achievement by the public school system. And now, while white student scores, are, as you mentioned, mediocre compared to other states, or they are in decline or stagnant, when they are compared to other states, Minnesota white students do tend to outperform certain states that may surprise some of Minnesotans or may not surprise Minnesotans. But even with that, as I mentioned, these rankings factor in other things such as graduation rates, right? So Minnesota graduation rates have been on the rise over the past several years, and that's pointed to as a great achievement. But when you dig into why that's happening, you can point to the fact that, well, in 2013, Minnesota's legislature removed a state exit exam requirement for graduating. So that kind of dilutes the graduation requirements. And so even if you have a higher graduation rate, that doesn't mean or measure actual learning on that student's part. So, as our test scores show, we can be graduating a higher number of students. But if test scores are in decline, if college readiness exams show that they're not prepared or equipped with the material that they need to be successful in college or other post secondary options, then those higher graduation rates don't hold a lot of meaning.
What I've found really interesting was that you looked at NAEP, which is different than just looking at our state tests, our state MCA tests. And the NAEP test that you looked at, it's national, it's a benchmark test, it's nationally normed. And when you talk to national experts, they basically say that achievement and funding are linked, which is one of the things that you're disputing. You're like uncoupling those two things. But you are basically showing that even on NAEP, nationally benchmarked or whatnot, we're either middling, flat, or declining for at least 5 or 6 years. And during that exact same time, spending was going up. Can you help us understand how there is just so much research that says spending matters, funding matters? Teachers Union constantly say we need to fully fund our schools. Researchers support them in saying funding matters. It makes a difference and that achievement is linked to it. But Minnesota doesn't seem to prove that out. What gives on that part of it?
What I'll say, it's not just Minnesota that hasn't proved it, it's other states as well. When you look at how much New York, for instance, spends per student, even after adjusted for regional cost differences, people will say, oh, well, New York is a more expensive place to live. So even factoring that in, the dollars that they spend per student does not reflect in their academic performance. So it's not just limited to Minnesota. We see that in other states as well. And to your point, the reason that I use NAEP is because, as you mentioned, it is a federally required test. And so it is the only test that can be used to compare states' performance to each other and students' performance in one state to another state, because Minnesota's state-based tests, the MCAs, are based on our state standards, which could differ from another state. And so I think the problem is that the conversation around money and whether or not it matters is focusing on the wrong piece of it. Oh, we must spend more to increase results. Well, we haven't seen that happen. And teachers unions calling for fully funded schools, even fully understanding what that means. What does it mean to fully fund our schools? Education Minnesota, Minnesota's teachers union has said we need to spend $4 billion more every year or every biennium to fully fund our schools. But my pushback to that is if there was a magic number that would cause our students to just catch up with every students in not only other states but other countries as well. When we compare the U.S. to other countries, wouldn't we already be looking to spend that dollar amount if there was a certain number that certain dollar sign that we needed to reach? And the problem with that is spending more doesn't automatically equate to success. It matters far more how money is spent than how much. And we've seen that play out in states that spend far less per student and serve similar student demographics as Minnesota, such as Mississippi and Texas, and their student performance, especially among their students of color, they're outperforming Minnesota students of colors. So again, it's not to say that money can't matter. It's that it hasn't, and that focusing on money as the only solution causes us to continue to leave far too many students behind.
So when I said that there's some explosive things in this report, that's one of them. So, and I saw you give a presentation on this, and you had a chart that basically showed the difference between Minnesota and Mississippi. This is where it gets explosive because Minnesota loves to look down its nose at anything south of Minnesota, and when you get down to places like Mississippi, it becomes particularly like snotty how our state is with Mississippi. I wrote something years ago about Mississippi and Minnesota, and it was called "Welcome to Mississippi," and it was basically saying, you know, what you have proven now is Minnesotans love to say, "Well, at least we're not Mississippi about things," and your report or your part of your presentation that you've given shows that for the last few years, Mississippi has outperformed Minnesota when it comes to kids of color, even though their levels of poverty is really different. What's behind that? Like, what's the data that proves that? What's the evidence?
I think the evidence, it goes back to what I just said, is how Mississippi is spending those dollars and focusing those dollars. Because you have a state like Minnesota that spends nearly $13,000 per student, and then you have a state like Mississippi, which is around nearly $9,000 per student, and they're able to serve a higher population of not only students of color but also low income students and help them make far more significant academic gains than Minnesota. So Mississippi's Black students make up around 49% of their student body,
Mm.
compared to Minnesota's 10.7%. And yet, in every subject tested, in every grade level on the NAEP test, Mississippi students of color, Black and Hispanic students, outperform Minnesota students of color, Black and Hispanic students.
Okay,
And
say that part again, because I think that say that again. What's that? Um,
so when I compared Mississippi students of color performance, and Mississippi categorizes their students of color as Black and Hispanic, their performance in fourth grade reading and fourth grade math, and eighth grade reading and eighth grade math, which are the two core subjects and the two grade levels that the NAEP tests assess, those students in Mississippi outperform Minnesota's Black and Hispanic students across the board. And what's equally important is that if you look at previous test results on the NAEP test, Mississippi's students of color, their scores are going like this, and Minnesota's Black and Hispanic students of color are going like this, or there's very inconsistent growth. So it's quite the head scratcher, because how is Mississippi able to serve more students from socially economically challenged backgrounds in a better way than Minnesota? And to your point too, everyone likes to say, "Oh, thank God for Mississippi," right? Thank goodness that we can point to a state who's on the bottom of the barrel when it comes to education, and we must be doing something right because we're ahead of them. And that's not to say that education or Mississippi's education system is perfect, because you can explore other areas and say, Minnesota's white students still outperform Mississippi's white students. But there is something to look into and to be said when Mississippi is figuring out how to give their students of color a more successful future by setting them up for success in the classroom in these early grades before they graduate.
Do we know anything about the why behind it? Like what they did? Did they have some magic program that they used?
A lot of focus has been placed on Mississippi recently because of their test score performance and because they have continued to outpace the growth in other states. And part of that goes back to their focus on reading literacy. And they've been very intentional with their dollars to focus not only on early reading literacy, so third grade reading literacy is so crucial to success in subsequent grades, but they also focus on the science behind reading. And that's something too that I think needs to be further explored is you have different teacher education programs to prep student teachers to enter the classroom, and how reading is taught is across varies greatly, and so they're really focusing on, okay, well, what is a science-based approach to reading that gives not only students the tools that they need to learn how to read properly, but how do we help teachers learn how to teach reading in a way that that follows the science and that is a sure way to help students gain that literacy at an early age. So that is a key part of Mississippi's strategy, is making sure that at third grade students can read, and other states have focused on similar things. Florida is another state who has made significant gains in closing their achievement gap between their white students and their Hispanic students. And again, it is because the state has focused their dollars on areas that matter and count instead of just splashing more money across the board into their per pupil expenditures. And then they've also adopted other education reforms that, frankly, Minnesota has pushed back on for years and has not been willing to try, even though Minnesota paved the way back in the early 1990s for school reform and education reform by passing the country's first charter school law. So Minnesota can't continue to go off of its past success and the few steps that it took to help set students up for success early on. Other states are outpacing us, and we need to figure out how we can catch up because our students are paying the price.
Do you think that there is any movement here within, like, what has been the response to your report? Any political response? Any folks locally here who are taking it seriously and thinking that we need to change course at all?
I'm hopeful that as more school reopening plans come to light and more individuals, taxpayers, and parents and state legislators read the report, that they'll reach out to have a serious conversation about this. I think some of this is getting lost with all of the COVID happenings and that sort of thing. But I also think it's a prime opportunity to challenge the status quo and to think through what we can change as we approach a new school year that is unprecedented, and as we decide, okay, do we really want to go back to how things were pre-COVID? Do we really want to go back to a status quo in a public school system that was failing so many students? So the conversations that I've recently had regarding this report, it just came out the end of July, but have really focused on people saying, thank you for discussing the fact that pouring more money into a broken system is bad policy, number one, and two, that we can't just hope to continue to pour more money into something for different results without admitting that we have a problem, that we have educational disparities, that we have persistent and stubborn achievement gaps, and money hasn't been able to solve them. So why do we think anything will be different moving forward? So that has been most of the conversations that I've heard. I've had school board members reach out to me and say, thank you for starting this broader conversation about Minnesota's public school system. Here's what we're doing. And so I'm careful in the report to say this isn't meant to discredit the great accomplishments that certain districts or even individual schools have made. But as a state, we must and we can do better. And it has to start by admitting that we have a problem. And I don't think we're willing to do that.
That's the first step to recovery. Admit you
Exactly.
have a problem. So listen, I have kind of a more philosophical question for you around conservatives are on a spectrum. of how they're looking at this issue now. For as long as I've been around in Minnesota, people right of center and conservatives have pushed accountability. They have pushed test-based accountability, performance, teacher evaluation, ratings of schools, standards, set standards. We've had epic standards wars in Minnesota. Some people watching might remember Profiles of Learning, I think it was called. And it was just this weird, bizarre array of ways of not using test scores, but using this weird mix of like 80 different things to rate schools and students on meeting standards. And it was in place for 2 or 3 years. Then it went away. It got replaced by 4 or 5 other things since. This is my long-winded attempt to say what has changed over time, though, is that it feels like conservatives today are having a little bit of a civil war on whether accountability is even a thing anymore, with some more on from conservative, from Republican and libertarians. They're sitting in different places about whether or not we should even be judging schools using test scores, whether the state should demand test scores, whether the federal government should be demanding test scores. I thought it was interesting. Your report's called Allergic to Accountability. And it feels like many conservatives are backing away from accountability. Do you see that as a truthful assessment of the situation? And where are you landing on accountability as an issue for conservatives?
No, I think that's fair. And I think it comes down to how do you define accountability too, right? There is a push, as you mentioned, to get rid of standardized tests and that sort of thing. My response to that, though, is that while I agree that test scores are not the only indicator of success, they do play a key role in evaluating learning because they are objective, standardized measures of student achievement on academic or proficiency standards. And we have to have a way to measure students' growth and make sure that we are providing an equal education to students, right? If we are trying to make sure that every single student is set up for success, and we are helping them prepare for that by a set number of standards and what those standards test, then we can track that and see how effective schools are doing in meeting that. So I think it places a healthy pressure on schools to make sure that students are moving up that trajectory at the same pace and improving. And so I think they do play a role. And I think removing test scores from the equation completely would be a mistake. Um, but to your point too about just this kind of this disagreement on accountability, I think part of the problem is that nobody wants to be portrayed as being against a kid, right? And so
Mhm.
spending more money is a popular message because it looks like you are making an attempt to fix problems and you're not doing anything that would further harm students. So that's a piece of the accountability, right? Is it's a spending accountability piece. But it's also not only just a spending piece, like here's the total money that you're being given, but also accountability around how that money is spent. And our Office of the Legislative Auditor has found that tracking how school districts spend the specific funds that they get to help their low performing students, and then how those students perform academically, the relationship between that is unknown. And so we need to get more of an accountability system in place, not only at the state level for when they decide if schools need more money or if the per pupil funding formula needs to be increased, but also more accountability at the district level as well and with school leadership. Okay, you're given this money. Now, how are you choosing to spend it? How much of it is actually getting to students in the classroom versus going into administrative overhead and that sort of thing? And so I see that's why I think the title of the report is so fitting, Allergic to Accountability, because there are different layers of where accountability is broken down. And you have conservatives saying, oh well, if we disagree with spending more money, then we're going to seem anti-kid or anti fixing the problem. And I push back on that and I say, okay, well, show me how well the current dollars are working. If
Hmm.
you legitimately want to increase spending because you believe that that's a solution, then you need to make that argument, that honest argument, before Minnesota taxpayers, before families, before teachers, before students, and tell them why you think that is the case. Because if you look at our track record, that argument has not played out well. And I think continuing to focus on rhetoric versus actual solutions um, leaves people not being trusted, leaves us not having faith in our state leaders to provide for our most vulnerable students, and leaves us in a place where we don't feel represented by our elected officials to do the right thing for our students.
What I think is interesting about the money matters conversation and research is I feel like in some ways we've lost that conversation nationally. The researchers and the people in higher ed who study the issue have a decisive win on their hands. It's hard to get the public imagination away from the idea that money and funding is what is the decisive thing in improving schools and improving education. But we never really talk about the spending. We don't talk about the fact that, there are school districts in Texas, for instance, that have spent 80 and $90 million on high school football stadiums, right? And you have to think like a $90 million football stadium in a public high school. But the schools are underfunded, right? The schools don't have enough money. Here in Minnesota, our auditor did a report, I believe it was the auditor, that found that $600 million that is earmarked for struggling kids, number one, couldn't be tracked. Like they couldn't find out where it was going and what districts were doing with it. And it turns out districts were doing all kinds of fancy stuff that maybe didn't have anything to do with what it was earmarked for, which was to improve achievement. And no one blinked an eye. No one blinked an eye. Our political class, this is a crazy headline. $600 million, yet achievement gap persists. And they bury the lead, which is, but we couldn't find that money either, really. We don't know 100% of what's going on with it. Didn't even make a dent in the politics here locally. Do you think there is a way to get the public focused on spending as much as funding?
I think we need to, right? We have, to your point too, yes, states are giving school districts more money, but then how the districts are spending it is a key part that's missing from the conversation. And then you have, school boards as well who go before their local communities and say, hey, you need to vote on this levy this fall so that we can get more money because our district is underfunded. How many parents know where to go to search for how much the district is already spending and how those dollars are being used? It's not easy to find. So I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because that's my next project that I'm working on since the release of this report, is creating a one-stop shop, if you will, a website landing page where parents, taxpayers, anyone who's interested can go and choose from a drop-down menu a school district or enter their zip code and identify the school district that's where they live, and not only find out how much that district is spending or reports to be spending, but then what I call true per pupil expenditures, because a lot of the districts report their spending, leaving out key categories that should be factored into that overall per pupil dollar amount. And so my goal with that is to bring more accountability and more transparency to how districts are using their dollars so that parents can see, okay, here's how much is being spent. Here are the test scores or the academic progress over the years to show, okay, are we getting what we should be getting for the dollars being put into education? And then they can take that information and go before their local school boards and their school leadership and say, hold on, here's what we're spending, here's the results. I think there's a disconnect. Help me understand. And so I want to empower more parents and families with that information because it's not easily accessible and it's not easily trackable, as well as the Office of the Legislative Auditor found out. So it's a big piece of the puzzle.
If you solve that, I think you'll be on to something, number one. I remember years of parents in Minneapolis trying to figure out school level spending, like at their school level. And the information that they got from the district was just really a NASA project. It was impossible to decipher how much money was making it to a school, right? And the district would provide these big data sets that weren't I think they were purposely hard to understand and read so that we couldn't know how much was actually reaching the school in the classroom. But the suspicion was a lot of money was going in, very little of it was actually landing in the lap of the kid, right?
Right. And that's
So,
something that I'm working on tracking as well. So not only figuring out true per pupil expenditures, which interestingly enough, and if someone's watching and can tell me why, I haven't been able to discover this, but interestingly enough, school districts reported per pupil expenditures exclude food services, building construction, and debt service, which I think are three categories that should be factored in because food services involves, right, the food program, the lunch program, that sort of thing. Kids need to eat during the day. Building construction, I understand that schools aren't building new buildings every year, but kiddos need classrooms to go to school in and safe buildings and that sort of thing. So these dollars need to be accounted for, and they're not. And so it's leaving parents and taxpayers thinking, oh, okay, this district is only spending, $9,000 per student, when in actuality it's closer to $15,000 or $16,000 per student. So that's one piece
mhm.
of it. And then another piece of it, um, aside from pairing that with academic achievement results, is looking at, okay, the percentage change in district spending of instructional costs versus administrative costs. So I'm tracking the percentage change of growth over a set number of years to say, okay, so instructional costs, that is what directly benefits students. How many dollars are being added to that over the years versus administrative costs? And I think for some of our larger school districts and some of our school districts that maybe we think are struggling because they don't get enough funding from the state, I think that breakdown will be very fascinating to a lot of Minnesotans.
Minnesota, actually not Minnesota as much. I don't know actually as much about this with Minnesota, but Illinois and California for sure, the percentage that is going just into teacher pensions is so outstanding. It's like 30 cents on the dollar or something that for sure is never going into the classroom, not in the district, not into instruction. It's going straight up into pensions, which is like legacy costs. And it's penalizing children of today for teachers of yesterday. Right. So
Mm.
if I live in Illinois, I probably would be do better to go across a state line where my kid's not going to be penalized for dumb promises the state made to yesterday's teachers. Because I have a kid today. I don't have a kid yesterday. I have a kid today. And if your state made really dumb promises to the teachers of yesterday, that's a problem. But I have a question for you on that. When I start thinking about policy prescriptions is where a lot of this stuff falls apart, because then everybody's going to argue about any policy prescription. But would you support, and this is a little bit off of the topic of your
Putting me on
report,
the
but
spot, huh?
yeah, put you on the spot. Would you support like a state law that prevented states from signing things around pensions and stuff like that they can't afford, and school boards from signing teacher contracts they can't afford, so that it doesn't happen anymore? I mean, you have districts like St. Paul, for instance, signed teachers contracts over two different cycles that they literally couldn't afford. Like they literally couldn't afford it. Like if they were already in a deficit spending situation, and they signed two very expensive contracts with all kinds of bells and whistles on it with zero accountability for what that money is going to be used for. Definitely not going to be used for students and for parents in those cases. So on the spot, would you support some sort of legislation in Minnesota to prevent districts from doing that and the state from doing it?
The shorter answer is yes, absolutely. You mentioned Illinois and California, but Minnesota struggles with underfunded public sector pensions as well. I think we only, right now, for our across the state, we only have about 65% of or so of our pensions funded. And so that's a lot of unkept promises, as you mentioned, to not only students from yesterday, today, but also in the future as well. Because if we don't change how these pensions are funded, and if we don't take accountability on poor budget decisions and unfunded liabilities and that sort of thing, our teachers are going to suffer. Those who are paying into the pension system and hoping for that kept promise of a pension when they retire, but the students as well. And I look at Wisconsin and how they reformed their pension system. And right now, they are number one in the country for how well their pension system is funded. They are at 100% of their pension system is funded. And so there are clearly reforms that we can do surrounding our pension system. And that involves, taking accountability for poor budget decisions made pre-COVID, because there is a lot of complaint that, oh, the coronavirus will hurt pension systems and how well they're able to be funded moving forward. But all that COVID did is expose the issues that these pension systems had in previous years. It didn't create the problems to begin with. And so we see that even in this education discussion on how students' needs aren't being met. That was an issue pre-COVID, and the coronavirus revealed how these disparities are being exacerbated. So pensions are, definitely an important piece of it. I write about them at times on the center's website. And so I think looking at how that system is funded and reforming it, like other states have done, is important.
So now I do want to put you on the hot seat.
Even more so than pensions?
Yeah. Well, pensions are easy for me. I mean, it's a dumb public policy area that is understudied. And I think the only reason that it doesn't get the attention and doesn't get cleaned up is because of the political forces that will come after you. And you probably know this as well as I do. If you go up to our state capitol, for instance, there's the, four horsemen of the apocalypse up there. There's the teachers union, the school board union, the superintendents, and whatever parent organizations they've co-opted. And those groups kind of run the state house here in terms of education policy. Pensions would be a third rail to touch. Funding is a third rail. And accountability is a third rail, which really made me reach out to you when I saw your report, because our chronic problem in this state is that there's always a need and a want for more money, less accountability. It's the only thing they negotiate. It's the only thing they care about. You can sum up, I hate to be a simple person, but sometimes the world is very simple, and you can sum up 100% of their agenda as more money, less accountability, fewer strings. But hot seat time. All right. So we have these problems, and there are going to be solutions proposed by all the different camps who are working in education in Minnesota, for instance, and I'm sure it's the same in other states. We have, as one of the proposals, we have a constitutional amendment that's being proposed that would make quality education a human right, or a right in the state of Minnesota, by changing, I think it's just like several words in the state constitution. The teachers union is against this constitutional amendment, and you are against this constitutional amendment, which I think is a weird confluence.
It is weird. And let me touch on that first, because I was wondering if you were going to bring up the amendment at all. The teachers union is opposed to it, though, for very different reasons than I'm opposed to it, from my understanding. The teachers union is opposed to it because they believe that it will turn into some type of school choice expansion, or allowing families to access another learning environment outside of the public school that they're in. And so I think if a couple of the words were tweaked, the teachers union would hop on board. I don't want to speak for them, but to my understanding, that is the main reason that they are opposed to it. And then I think another reason is because they appreciated the word uniform in there to make sure that the public school system was the same across the board statewide. But my opposition to it is out of concern that it will be some more rhetoric without actual solutions. And the center has written a little bit on this, but there's obviously we haven't written a whole lot because there's still a lot of unknowns, right? The authors of this proposal haven't answered some of the important questions regarding the change in words, such as, well, who's going to define what type of standards need to be met in order to ensure that the students have access to this excellent education. And then that sort of thing. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions, and they're very vague and broad. My concern, aside from it just being all words with no results, is that it will put our education system in the hands of the judicial branch, and we will see too much litigation come out of this, and that will cause more families and students to spend time in courts fighting this. It'll result in lost learning time because of it. And I recognize that the authors agree with me that this is a problem, and so I commend them on trying to approach a solution, because we've been discussing our achievement gap and our education disparities for years. But I think their approach is misguided, even though I'm sure it is well intentioned. And I don't think it will result in the meaningful change for all students that the state requires. I feel it will do more harm than good, and that's very concerning to me, because where we're at right now, our students can't afford to lose any more progress. And I recognize as well that the authors have pointed to other states. They like to point to Florida and say, well, Florida did this, they amended their constitution. And while that is accurate, that's only part of the story as well. You have to look at all of the other education reform efforts that Florida did, paired with changing their constitution. Changing words in a document doesn't guarantee that that document and those words will be upheld. Just look at what our current constitution says about providing students education, and we're failing to meet their needs. So I welcome a more robust conversation around this, but I'm pushing back because my fear is that it won't provide the change that it's promising, and it will in fact do more harm.
So let's fight on this one. Let's fight on this one. So, so first of all, I think part of the union's pushback on this is exactly what you said, which is if you give parents the right to sue for their rights in education, they'll do it. And they're going to clog up the courts with a bunch of parents like suing because they don't like the public schools. And they don't like the thing that they're getting, which to me sounds exactly like what parents should do if they're trapped in schools with no options and no choices. And there's no accountability in those schools in the state. And they want something different. Like suing is the way that we make things happen oftentimes. So that's one point, is like, I think the union struggled for a reason to be against this. So they came up with, well, it's going to clog up the courts and too many parents will fight for it. I think you're right in that they believe that this will turn into a school choice program of some sort. And I think they're right on that, which is why I support it, is because I actually do believe that the end goal and the end result of this will be breaking down the logjam against school choice. Right, like this would, to me, in some way, result down the way, not right away, but it would eventually end up in a school choice because of one lawsuit or another. It'll make it easier for us to. Minnesota's so anti-school choice, and I think this would actually be one strategy for getting there. I don't think the people who are proposing it will say that and agree with me on that. That's just my own analysis of it. The other thing about the language.
Can I ask, though, too, how do you think it will open up the opportunity for school choice? Because obviously you and I are very much aligned with the need for that and expanded educational freedom in the state. But I am curious how you think the amendment will expand that, because every reference to it, refers to public schools and that sort of thing. So I would be curious to know your thoughts, because if that's the case, then, please convince me to change my mind. I'm open to changing my stance on it after learning more. But yes, curious, what piece of the proposal do you think will allow that expansion?
I think actually what will allow it is the lawsuits that are going to come out of it. I don't think the language itself does it. I think the lawsuits do it. Right. So I feel like because of what it is, it's giving parents a fundamental right that they can fight for that they don't have right now. And this thing about uniform education or adequate education in state constitutions is the thing that is routinely used to beat up on school choice proposals. That won't be uniform. Like, won't. So the Florida example to me is a miracle. And I've had Jeb Bush on a couple of times to talk about it. It's like a miracle to me. Much of what they did required enablers to be done. So they did have to make some subtle and nuanced moves on law here and there, nip and tuck, so that they could do these broader set of things. And so parents had more rights to be the one who's in control. The uniform thing, I think, kills us. Like that language around a uniform education actually is the best firewall to school choice. So by shifting that from a uniform system to parents and students actually having a fundamental right that they can fight for in court, I think at least it's a nuanced and small step. I agree with you, though. It doesn't change everything. It
Right.
doesn't change everything. Those few words are not going to like get us quality curriculum, teachers, pedagogy, standards, all that stuff. Um,
Yeah, and even outside of the Florida and the Florida example that is pointed to, you know, I guess my concern with turning over academic gains to the courts is that, or sorry, academic success and that sort of thing to the courts is that you can look at other states outside of the Florida example that haven't produced enduring academic gains or narrowing their racial gap by turning education to the courts. I can think of New Jersey, for example, in the
hmm,
late 1980s. I mean, I wasn't born, but the state Supreme Court, ordered that this funding in low income districts for reforms would increase. And yet today we see some of those districts in that state spending as much as $34,000 per student. And again, back to the money discussion, that their academic performance has not significantly improved, and in some cases it has fallen. So that's, one piece of it. I struggle that, because the amendment would ensure that this would be a new fundamental right in our state's paramount duty. I see that in legal terms equating to K-12 funding would always get the first dollar, which could crowd out other vital priorities that the state has, in hopes that maybe someday these public schools, quality education, they'll offer a quality education and achieve that.
hmm,
So,
hmm,
so that is a concern. But hey, I am very much excited that these conversations are happening and that we can actually explore things like this together, even if we disagree on what the end results will be, because that hasn't happened in the past to the extent that it should. um, but I do want to make sure that, that we, whatever we decide to do regarding the amendment, that the public is informed on what it would, involve, and some of it seems to be, up to interpretation. On, you and I are interpreting different pieces of it, differently, which I think is fine. But I do think that that should be, identified and addressed to prevent a lot of litigation issues that would come up from coming up. Because while I
hmm,
agree that, litigation could put pressure on the state to make changes, again, it's putting it in the hands of the judicial system to then go to the legislature and say, hey, fix this. My concern is that the legislature's response will be, okay, more money, and therefore
hmm,
nothing will
hmm.
actually get fixed or changed. But
Well, that's always gonna be the Minnesota legislature's response.
no, we
But
can
here's the
do
thing,
better, Chris. We have to be.
as you talk though, I feel like I am agreeing with you on, first of all, like the word change around it being about public schools for one would be helpful, like that because it limits it to like it once again conflates the right to public schools rather than broader solutions. So I think I'm agreeing with you on that part. I definitely agree with you on the result of a lot of these things is always going to be for the lawmakers to put more money. And I'm also though thinking that whatever victories we can have that shift the power to individual parents and families and students, we're chipping away at the hegemonic relationship of the Waltz, Ricker, Daphne kind of cabal, which
I
basically,
agree.
you
Yeah,
know,
I just think though that we can pursue other routes to get to the same goals that you and I know our state needs to get to outside of this. So, and because another piece of it too is that, um, I mentioned earlier, yeah, who would define the standards listed and determining whether students are achieving them. And I go back to our state's track record on that, and we have a really dismal track record of putting in place meaningful academic standards precisely because
mhm,
some kids fail to meet them. And so, I mean, we see that based on not only our state test performance, but then also on the NAEP test, the national assessment, that doesn't go off of state-based tests, but says here's what a student should know and should be able to learn. Minnesota students aren't there and are actually declining, over the years. So that's another concern as well, that, who would define these standards, and would they actually be up to par with where students, should be at a particular grade level on a certain grade subject, or will they, meet the standards, but it actually doesn't set them up for future success outside of the classroom?
Yeah, I'm looking at it too. I think that that's actually a fair kind of reading of it. It talks about the skills necessary for participation in the economy, democracy, and society. It talks about critical thinking and decision making skills as being the goal. And it says collectively, these are necessary for the exercise of individual rights and for providing individuals the opportunity to contribute to the economy and society as a whole. But all of that is a lot of language. It doesn't
It
necessarily
is.
say that you are going to know how to read, for instance.
Correct. Not only know how
Mm,
to read, but then how do you measure if a student is set up for success socially, economically, and that sort of thing? How is that going to be measured? Because my concern then is, okay, if a student graduates high school, doesn't pursue any college or post-secondary plans or whatnot, and just lives in the parents' basement, could that could those parents then sue the state and say, hey, you didn't prepare my child to be an upstanding
mhm,
citizen to participate in society, they're just at home doing nothing. So that's part of the language where I think, it needs to be defined. Like, how are you going to measure whether someone is set up for society and success there? Because, part of education, I think that we should be focusing on is, you don't only want students to be educated, but you want them to be prepared for citizenship, to be active members of society, to have meaningful
mhm,
lives. How that's defined, though, isn't very clear. And, that kind of brings me, though, to another point that I wanted to touch on is I think public schools could do a better job of preparing students for citizenship by focusing on some of these civic virtues that don't always get taught. The school that I taught in, we were very intentional about teaching virtues such as, what does citizenship look like? What does personal responsibility look like? Even the concept of friendship and that sort of thing. And so
mhm.
I think some of these civic virtues don't get brought up and don't get tied into life outside of the classroom in public school settings. And if the amendment wants to make that, if the proposal wants to make that a priority, then let's define what that looks like and let's define how teachers can implement that in their classrooms. Because I very much agree that their education reform efforts should be outside of just policy solutions and should involve molding a young child into the great human being that they will be outside of the classroom. And part of that is teaching them these virtues and how to live an upstanding life.
So I am definitely going to have you back on again so that we can spar on this one. This could be a whole different
Oh, spar,
discussion.
really?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, because I just wrote something about this. Uh, Now I'm going to mess it up. I think it was for R Street. Andy Smerick was on yesterday from the Manhattan Institute, and Andy had a collection of us write something around character education and how we felt about that in schools. And then I think I took a very libertarian take on it, which is basically that the government and the state should never be in charge of determining what kind of citizen it wants the consent of in the future, right? Like we should never put it like the idea that state agents would teach you how to be a consenting governed person is a weird power imbalance. And what if they get it wrong? And what if it becomes Stalin-esque? What if to be a good citizen, you must, whatever. And where's the freedom of the families to say, and individuals to say, no, 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 no. I have my own concept of what liberty, justice, virtues, values, and all that is. I don't need the state kind of hiring people to train my children on what they think. But Andy, who was on yesterday, it was really interesting to see me where conservatives and libertarians are have nuances between what they believe. People always put them in the same camp. But he actually, I think, and others authors in that series gave me a lot to think about. So I thought it was a good exercise. It was a good exercise to give us all that same question. But I definitely want you back on so that we can talk about
No,
this
that would be
one.
good. Yeah, I
Um,
would love to discuss that. I mean, the Sun recently published a symposium too on, I think it's 30 essays or so. I can send you a copy, but it's all different types of views answering the question, what is the role of personal responsibility in education and what does that look like?
mhm,
And to your point, different views have different opinions on how you first define personal responsibility, and then what that looks like in the classroom. Is it the parents' role? Is it a combination? I very much see the relationship between teachers, students, and parents as a triangle. As a teacher, I did not want to assume that my student was, only going to take what I told them. I was always in communication with the parent on,
Mhm.
their model of parenting and that sort of thing, because that partnership is so crucial. But then there would be times where I would have to convey to the parent, your student needs to understand that hard work is expected regardless. There are high expectations for this student. And so, help figuring out what that looks like at home life versus school life and that sort of thing. So I very much agree that that's a conversation that teachers, parents, students should all have. And I always did with mine, versus just teachers saying, this is how it is, this is how you should live, and that sort of thing. But for
Or the state saying what all teachers should be saying when, the thing about school choice is you can choose a hippie school, you can choose a Christian school, you can choose a military school, a skills-based school, a 3 R's, just the reading, writing, arithmetic, back to basics schools. The schools I joke about all the time where the kids roll around and eat paste all day long and everybody feels real happy about it or whatnot. That's school choice. But if the government ever stepped in and said, no, that thing about uniformity again, all our schools will do X, all of our teachers will do X, it gets a little weird. And I know you're not saying that. I'm just talking about a slippery slope when the state starts acting that way. Then it becomes, you get there pretty quick. But I know we're running out of time. I actually just wanted to run through a couple actually that I know you're going to dispense with quickly and easily, so you don't have to worry about them taking long. So there's another lawsuit that is around integration, and that lawsuit would, the premise of that lawsuit is that everything will change if we integrate our schools. Like all the achievement will go up. All of the social science research that they're bringing to the court basically says that all research indicates that this is the way to go. So what's your take on that suit as a proposal? Not a proposal, as a solution.
What is the name of the suit? I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that one.
Maybe
it will be a quick response.
Yeah, that's Cruz Guzman.
Cruz Guzman. Okay.
Yeah, Cruz Guzman, led by Dan Schulman and Myron Orfield. They've been suing the state for years around integration, and their research that they're bringing to the court says this is the only thing that works at scale, that fixes everything.
I am not as familiar with that case as my colleague Kathy Kirsten is. She's done more research around it and that sort of thing. But from what I know, and again, I'm open to learning more about it and understanding it better. It seems to be another solution that would do more harm than good. I think of a lot of the charter schools in Minnesota that serves a lot of students of color or low-income families, and how this would impact them and affect them and could result in a lot of them having to close. I taught at a Title I charter school, so I very much know how students from these backgrounds and their families rely on alternatives to their neighborhood public school. And so my fear is that those options would be taken away from them. And then, there's another piece of it too. Oh, well, look at some of these charter schools. I think of like Best Academy, where the students are predominantly students of color. There's no, that's segregation and that sort of thing. And I push back on that and say, well, let's look at why these families are choosing these school settings. They are making the choice to send their child to this school. They're not being forced to do so. There maybe is a sense of community by sending your child to a school where the students there look like your child, the teachers look like your child, and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of reasons that families choose the learning environment that they do. And I think getting the courts involved and having the state mandate and that sort of thing to decide this for families is very alarming.
It's even worse than that. It's even worse. Actually, the outcome of the case would penalize Best Academy for not attracting white students. So they actually literally could lose money if they cannot market themselves and acquire white students at Best Academy and Hiawatha Academy and Global Academy. Keep going down the list, Hmong Academy, Hmong American. If they can't suddenly start attracting white students into their schools, they will lose money. Wow. They'll be penalized by the state.
And then you have, you have professors, Minnesota professors. I wrote about this the other day, saying that white parents
I saw that.
your students in public schools as an act of anti-racism.
Yeah.
So, instead of focusing on what's best for the child, we're getting into this guilt tripping and pointing fingers and saying, no, 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 you must be choosing this type of school because you're a racist or because of X, Y, and Z. Instead of taking a step back and truly understanding, why are these families leaving? Why
Hmm.
are they looking elsewhere? Families, you vote with your feet for public schools and other learning environments in Minnesota. We truly need to understand the why, and that is not happening. And part of it, I think, actually a large part of it, is because of the teachers union control within our public schools and their reluctance to look at any alternative that would shake up the status quo, even if it would benefit students. If you're truly all about the kids, why are you trying to get rid of options that students of color and their families are running to? Why are you trying to ban options that have been proven to help students of color when public schools haven't? I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And the answer
Well, I mean, we kind of know that
is
we know
because
the
it's not about the kids.
well, I was about to say, and we know the business answer to that, which is they are not against anything until it takes dues out of their coffers. So if you propose anything that has non-unionized teachers, for instance, it's bad. Doesn't matter anything else. Everything else, well, it's great for kids. Does it take money from unionized teachers? Well, yeah. Well, then it's bad. I
Right.
mean, like, why
Where
are
does
we
the
still
kids
even talking about
benefit?
this?
Right.
Yeah. So, like, even if kids and families, but it gives families freedom. Yeah, but does it take money out of the coffers? Which is
Right.
sad, but that is the savage business, I think, mentality of the teachers union agenda in this state and probably in all others. There were three others, so I want to have you back again because there's
We
so
can
much
talk
more
about
for us to
teachers
talk
union
about.
in its own segment as
Yeah.
well.
Well, and so there were three other proposals that are in Minnesota that I think would take more time to talk about. But one of them was a lawsuit around teacher LIFO, last in, first out policies, and how the quality of teaching could be improved if we struck down LIFO instead of merit blind layoff decisions is what it was. It was an attempt to end merit blind layoff decisions so that we could keep quality teachers in schools. That suit failed, again, because of who it impacted. Graduation requirements is something that you have talked about. Getting rid of graduation requirements actually lowered the standards of who's graduating and possibly could demotivate kids to actually try harder when they know that there's no stakes involved in graduating. I don't know that you said it that way, but that's my take on it. And then discipline. That's the one where you and I can have an entire show on it because I know we disagree on the discipline thing. Um, as a not I shouldn't say it that way. As a proposal for what would change the game, I think it's such a small subset of kids that are actually in the discipline net, like in that net. It's like 16% or less in Minneapolis, for instance. And all the rest of the kids are still not learning, right? So like we could focus on that 16% of kids and get them all taken care of and squared away, which Minneapolis does. They put them in a separate school called Harrison. So they pull them out of the main schools and put them in Harrison so that they can make the test scores look better in their other schools. And it still doesn't work.
Hmm.
Even after you take them out of the schools, people still aren't learning to read. They still have no accountability, no anything. Anyways, so I want to have you back again. There's so much in preparing for this show, there's so much that you have added to the conversation here in Minnesota. I think you're actually on the vanguard because our conversation has gone so stale in this state. You're raising issues that I think should be raised again. They should come back again. So hopefully you'll come back. Loved your report. What are your final words? Because I want to give you the final word on all of this. What's the most important takeaway that people should have from Allergic to Accountability and the issues that you're raising?
Well, first of all, they should read the entire report because every sentence is worthwhile. But the final takeaway is that Minnesota can do better and we must do better. And I'm so thankful for individuals like you and groups that you're a part of and that you and the families that you advocate on behalf of, because we need more of that happening in the state. And we need to make sure and equip parents with the information and knowledge so that they can hold not only their school district accountable, but so we can hold the state accountable, because we are failing too many students and they deserve access to an excellent education that sets them up for a bright and successful future.
Excellent. Well, this has been an hour with Catrin Wigfall. She's a policy fellow at the Center for American Experiment, Center of the American Experiment. She is also the director of Educated Teachers Minnesota and Employee Freedom Minnesota. The report that we've been discussing today is called Allergic to Accountability. It's a report put out by the center that I think everybody should read. I put the link to it in our comments, and not just read it, but share it with others. I hope that we could keep talking about it. I also want to highlight that Catrin has experience in education policy through the Heritage Foundation, which is, there's some friends from the Heritage Foundation that are friends of this show. And was also a Teach for America core member, who is also another group that is a friend of this show. And the California Policy Center, who we have a person here on in the comments who comes every day and watches every day from the California Policy Center. So you're in good company, Catrin. Thank you so much. And you will definitely get an invitation for us to continue talking.
Great. Look forward to it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And for everybody watching, this has been another hour with you. I appreciate it that you come here every morning, that we're able to talk about important issues in education, and that you give us